But the general idea for risk and risk analytics is, how do you measure risk? Because risk could mean a lot of different things. It's not as simple as, is it risky or is it not risky? Really, there could be different types of risks, and maybe it's up to a business even to classify which things they consider a risk or how risky something is for them in their business. And, there could be risky things like, hey, if you can create new admin users in Azure, that implicitly is a risk. It's a technical risk. You could do lots of bad things after you did that. There's a risk it could be data access risks, that you can access data that is risky, that if it gets out there, that's inherently risky because you have access to data, risky data loss prevention. Or you can have the traditional version of risk, GRC, governance, risk, and compliance, which is for ERP systems, which is financial risk. The big cases that make the headlines when somebody makes an illegal trade. Societe Generale, that's one of the big ones that started off all these companies spending a lot of money on risk software, was when they had a trader that lost them like $1 billion because he could approve his own trades. So being able to make a trade and approve a trade, that's a financial risk, and that can lead to billions of dollars of lost money. Creating your own purchase order and approving your own purchase orders is a way that people cheat companies. You'll set up a fake company, and you'll create purchase orders for your company, and then you approve the purchase order. So you're, in essence, paying yourself, and it looks like a legal transaction. That's another way people can cheat companies. And so those are financial risks, and that's the traditional version. Now that we have cloud infrastructure entitlement management and cloud systems, there's been more of a focus on infrastructure and technical risks as well, instead of just the traditional GRC system, which looks at financial risks and it's system by system. So analysts will ask you, or customers will ask you, do you support cross-system risk? Because the traditional systems could only identify risks within one system, like in the ERP system, not the idea that you could do something in Salesforce.com and then you could do something in SAP, and the combination of those cross-system actions might be risky. So that's a big feature that they are looking for, and of course we have it. I mean, that's not a surprise. So what you can do and what you can access, and it's hard. And I won't dive into this until later. Let's keep it simple. I tried to keep it simple for their example. So let's go to the basis of risk is being able to do or access risky stuff, right? So in EmpowerID, we call those functions. A function is something you can do, an activity, a task, a function. And these functions are things that you can define yourself. You can come in here and you can say, okay, I want to know who can reset admin passwords. That's something someone can do that we would consider, let's say, data protection risk. You can classify it how you want. You can say, how risky is it? We'd say that's like very critical, high risk. You can assign it to a risk set, which basically is just a way, if we wanted to export these, to say I want to export all other ones for Active Directory. If you create a new one for Active Directory and we want that to end up being something shipping that we can implement at other customers, you might say, I'm going to come in and create functions for Active Directory so we can export them as ready-to-use functions. So this, I'm just going to stick it in default. We're not going to save it. And then, of course, you could say, then the compilation time is how often is it going to identify people who match this function, people who can do this thing that we're specifying. We haven't specified the matching logic of how the system figures out who can reset admin passwords yet, but this is how often it's going to schedule to evaluate that logic to figure out who matches, who can do it. So that's where you'd create a global function. Now, I created one just called test function to keep it completely simple. I created a test function. And a global function is like in the case of our reset admin passwords, the global is just the definition. It's, hey, this is something people could do. And this is how we classify it as the type of risk and the risk level. Now, but no one actually has a global function. You actually have a local function. And why is there a global function versus a local function? Well, you might want to be able to report on everyone who can reset admin passwords, but then you need to know reset admin passwords in Azure might be different than reset admin passwords in Google GCP or reset admin passwords in SAP, because you might handle those differently. You might treat them differently in risk policies. Because like, let's say one policy is you can't create a user and then reset their password. Well, then it globally being able to reset a password doesn't make sense. You need to be able to say, create a user in SAP and reset a password in SAP for that to be a valid combination. So that's why you have a local function. Or creating a purchase order from a financial perspective. If you can create a purchase order, that's great. But creating a purchase order for Germany and then being able to also approve a purchase order for Germany is where you get into trouble. Not being able to create a purchase order and approve a purchase order, because if you can't do it at the same local level, then there's no risk there. So that's why you have local. Now, in my case, I just made it stupid. I just said, I'm going to create just one local test function because I was trying to keep this simple. So we have a test function, and we said, now the mappings are where you decide, you tell the system how it can figure out when it does a compilation, who or what grants the ability to do this function. So this is where all the logic is in the mapping. And you can do it depending upon the system and how deep our connector goes into that system. You could go coarse-grained or shallow, or if we have a connector that goes deep, like SAP, then you could do a deep mapping. And I'll explain the difference between the two. Now, if anybody has a question at any point, feel free to raise your hand. Zakaria, is that a question, or that was from my previous question, right? If you have a question, another one, go for it, though. Nope. But if anybody has a question, raise your hand, and somebody feel free to stop me. Artie has a question. Hey, Artie.
Hey, Patrick. Patrick, I remember we had that conversation about how mappings functions can be assigned only to people, right? Where you have some underlying person object.
No, a function can be assigned to any assignee. So what we resolve it to, I'll get to that, but a risk violation. So functions, like let me show you this as an example. Mm-hmm. If we look at who has this function, we'll look at the mappings in a minute. But if we look at the engine calculates all of the assignees that have that function, and an assignee could be like an SAP group, a user
a business role location, yeah.
Mm-hmm. So it calculates every possible thing that somehow that has that function, that it either, if you get added to it, or it has that function. So so assignees can be the functions can be anything. The violation of a risk policy currently only supports person. You have to have a person object if you're going to violate a risk policy.
Got it.
Because a role is just a role. It can't go out and do anything. It can't create a purchase order and approve a purchase order. Only a person can do that.
Got it.
That's why that works like that. Any other questions so far? Nope. Okay.
So, Patrick, one question. So
yeah, go.
Follow up on Artie's question, basically. So if some admin misconfigures a particular delegation or something which should be highlighted, so only when a person would get it, they would know the risk, right? In that context, like until someone gets assigned, there's no risk. No one is detecting it.
So that's actually a very astute point, Omer, that I would like to add. I've been talking to Carlos about this. I think I have a JIRA out there. So what you're mentioning is, so hold on. Well, I will get there. Remind me about that. So basically what you're saying is, if let's say I create a management role, and the management role somehow has the create purchase order for Germany function, and the management role has the approved purchase order for Germany function, that management role, in essence, is violating my risk policy, correct? but it's not a violation because it's not a person. So yes, you are absolutely correct. But what I have created a non-compliant role. Now in EmpowerID, we have the data, and I'll show you that when we get into the advanced part, where we calculate for every risk policy what are called the rules. And the rules are, so we calculate every possible thing that a person could get added to, or combination of things that would violate a risk policy. So if you look in those rules, you would see that my management role, in combination with nothing just on its own, it does violate the risk policy. So what I want to do with that next is for Carlos, when he compiles the rules, for any of those where you have one where the role itself it inherently violates the risk policy, for him to bubble up a different kind of violation or to set a status on the role that says it's a non-compliant role that's violating a risk policy, so that someone can easily see it and take action. So yeah, you're right. It won't generate a violation today, but we have the data where we could say inherently this role, if somebody gets added to it on its own with no other access, would violate a risk policy. We should be using that to ensure compliant roles, that no one creates non-compliant roles. That was a good question.
So would you do that? Would you do that based on like the assignee, if the exact same assignee, if the assignee is like a manager role and the exact same assignee is granting you both those functions?
I'll jump ahead and then we can jump back. But I'll show you exactly what that looks like. Since that's a topic of interest. So once you create your risk policy, and your risk policy can be different types. It can be, hey, if you can do this, it's risky. Like if you can delete an Active Directory domain controller, you don't need a combination. That's just risky, and that would be called a critical access type of risk. So it's not a segregation of duties. It's not if you can do this and this. It's literally if you have this one thing, then it's risky. Period. So that is one type of risk. So that would be your case, Phil. But let's go look at our policy. I'll show you. Hold on. Test. I think I called it test risk or test. Oh, I called it test segregation of duties because I was showing SOD. But anyway, when you go look at your risk policy, here's how you would see what we're talking about. When Carlos's engine compiles the risk policy, now a risk is simple. A risk is simply, since it's SOD, you can't do these functions if you can also do these functions. You can't create purchase orders for Germany and approve purchase orders for Germany because that would be bad. So the definition of a segregation of duties type risk is, hey, you shouldn't, if you can do any of these functions, then we better not find out that you can also do these functions, because the combination of those two would be a risk. Now, the risk engine, what it does is it says, okay, you can't have it, in this case, you can't have any of these functions, or if you have these functions. So it then goes and it looks, it knows it's already compiled every assignee that has every function. It does that independently. So it knows every assignee and every function. So then it can, in order to make the risk check quick, all this data has to be pre-compiled. So it always calculates who has which functions and it keeps that up to date. And then for every risk policy, it calculates the possible combinations of things that would violate that policy. So you said, here you can see it, that basically, hey, you can't have this group in combination with this group. You can't have this group in combination with this group. So if you see some in here where the one single group or role is enough to violate, then what you'd see is, I'll show you. You'd basically just see, in my example, you'd say, hey, this management role, and you'd say there'd be nothing to conflict with this assignee. So basically the rule would be, hey, if you get added to this management role, you're going to violate this risk, period.
Yeah. The management role conflicts with itself, basically.
Exactly. That's exactly it. Yeah, it inherently conflicts with itself. So we have that data. So we just need to take this and look at these ones where it conflicts with itself and bubble that up somewhere else as something else to do, like a status or a different type of violation, in order to make use of that data. Yeah, but this is why it's fast, because it pre-calculates, like, just for this one risk, there are 1,044 rules. So there are 1,044 ways you could break my one stupid risk violation policy.
Hey, Patrick, question for you.
Mhm.
If from the standpoint of inheritance, if I have a function that's assigned, a local function that's assigned to a particular group, and a local function that's assigned to another group, right? When that group is placed as an assignment within a management role, okay, does the system see that management role now as an assignee, as well as that group as an assignee?
It knows that the management role also grants the function.
Okay, so the management role is an assignee as well. Okay, so it's not just inherited as a calculation thing. It actually, when it compiles it and then populates whatever precompiled tables, it shows that management role actually physically is an assignee for the of that particular function.
Not directly. It shows as an inherited function. Like, if you look, like, even if you go look at a person assignee, RT is not assigned to these functions directly. But when you make the call to get her resultant function, it shows that, hey, she has all these functions. She has looks like she has 13 functions in the system.
Okay.
So we can see her functions, and we'll see this later. But one of the coolest things is it's kind of like a graph database concept without a graph database. But you can see where traceability. So you could follow the bouncing ball and see, okay, that RT has approved PO. Because she has a write directly. So let's find one. An interesting one. Here we go. RT has this demo function because RT is assigned to the source assignee. So the source assignee, we know this could be 5 layers deep, like your case, Phil. But here it'll show the original thing that has the function. So in this case, the original thing is the management role that has the function. Or the original thing is, let's say, this Active Directory group that has the function. So it'll show
it's whatever she's directly assigned to. Basically, her assignment is to the management role, and she's inheriting that function because she's assigned to that management role.
The simplest mapping is the coarse grain. And that's where you say, okay, I'm going to come in here and I'm going to say, well, this particular assignee type, and typically it would be like you're inventorying for most systems groups. From SAP, the roles and profiles come in as group. From ServiceNow, they come in as groups. Everything comes in as a group mainly. So usually it would be a group, but it doesn't have to be. And you'd say, okay, this particular, let's say, purchasers group in operational purchasers from SAP, I want to explicitly map and say, hey, this group allows people who are members to do this function. That's coarse grain. Or I say, I'm creating management roles, and I created a management role for developers, and I'm saying, hey, the business development department management role can do these 10 functions. And that's coarse grain. It's you're just saying, hey, this thing, if you get it, and that's what I have here, just to show a simple example. I'm saying anybody who's a member of this group, which I named test function group, just to keep it simple, has the function called test function. So if you get added to this group, and then you're going to have this function, and this group has this function. That's the way that works. So that's the simple coarse grain mapping. And if your connector to that system doesn't go any deeper than users and groups, then that's what you're stuck with, basically. You can do some cool stuff, though, where you can do query-based collections to get creative. Like, let's say I wanted to tag with a function everybody who was an untrusted, let's see if I have it in this system. No, I don't have that, but I have something similar, not to pick on any country, but let's say you wanted to tag everyone who is security sensitive and shouldn't have certain access. Then you could create a function called should not have government restricted access. And then you can create a query-based collection and say, hey, everybody matching this criteria, I'm going to have them get this function. And then automatically, then you have this function where you know that everybody in Iran has this function, and you can set up all kinds of cool SOD that says, okay, everybody in Iran shouldn't be able to log into production domain controllers, and everybody in Iran shouldn't be able to approve purchase orders. And so you can use the functions in lots of interesting ways beyond the traditional way of doing things. You can tag everybody who's an Azure B2B guest user, tag them with the function external, and then they shouldn't be able to do certain things because they're an external guest. You can do all kinds of crazy stuff like that. But that's the coarse grain. So you can get creative on it, but it's still coarse grain. Now, and the engine will compile, and everybody who's added to this group, it will figure out they can do this function. Now, the fine grain is where, for a system where you have the permission, so systems that have roles that grant permissions. If we go all the way down to the permissions level, like we do for SAP, we get the T codes, like we do for Azure, like we will be doing for upcoming connectors that are in progress, like the Google GCP and AWS and others. Then the good thing about that is a permission could be assigned today to 5 different groups in that system. But tomorrow, a new group could be created that grants that permission. And one of those 5 groups tomorrow could lose the permission. So if you're doing it at coarse grained, you're trusting that what you're saying is still true and that you're not missing things. If you do it at the permission level, so in this case, we created one rights mapping policy. And then if we dig into that, okay, so let me refresh. So let's go back, our rights mapping policy. So basically the idea is, just to simplify it, is that if we have the rights from a system, like let's say delete, here's an SAP T code that's called delete demand. Here's probably a EmpowerID application right. Here is a, what else we got in here? Here's a delete for Azure license pools. So that you can pick rights from any system that we have the rights, and you can also do data level. So you could say create purchase order as a right, but then you could pick the attribute company and the range of company code Germany. So that's where you get down to the data level, beyond the right, down into the data level. But we won't go into that today. But just so you know, you can do that. And now here, all we did is we picked the right from SAP, the T code ME21N, which is create purchase orders. So now, if some user has an SAP role or composite role that grants a single role or a profile, or however they got it, or a new role gets created tomorrow that they get assigned to, if it grants this right, then we know they have the permission to create purchase order. So that's why when you go back out here and you look at the assignees, it's not only that Azure group that we map, it's all these other things that popped in here, because all of these somehow grant purchaser. That makes sense, ERP purchaser. These grant that ME21N right. So if you can go to the rights level, then your risk policies are more self-maintaining, and you're less likely to have blind spots. But that necessitates that the system has those rights available, and it follows that type of model, and that we build a connector that uses our PBAC data model to put those rights into a PBAC system, because then the connector has to pull those in as AZ local rights, and then typically they're bundled up into AZ local roles. So the connector has to be specialized for that. And it makes sense for systems that are high risk, high value, that you'd want a connector that is deeper than just users and groups. So now you can also, if a system has roles, role definitions, like let's say Azure, then where Azure and lots of systems have true role definitions, true RBAC definitions, where they have definitions for roles like application group contributor, where those roles grant specific rights. And then those roles, role definitions, can be used in assignments assigning them to users, to groups, directly or scoped by location and the tenant. So because we also allow you to pick specific role definitions, which are bundles of rights, and you can pick those and map those as well. So if you got a group administrator, so now just to build up, we created a test function, and then I created the same thing for a test segregated function. Again, it's the same thing. It's mapped the same. It's mapped to a group called test segregated group in Azure, and it's mapped to the other, the SAP right for approved purchase order. So then once you have your functions, then you can look at them. You can instantly see, you know, who has which function, where's it coming from. And we've also built this into a lot of user interfaces. So as an example, just to show you how this is handy. So even if you don't use the risk, let's say I come in here and I'm going shopping, and I want, as a user, I am going shopping, and I don't know which group I need. I have no clue which group I need, but I do know that I want to create a purchase order. I can now, since our system compiles everything that, so I can see, okay, create purchase order, that actually this particular group is the only one that I'm eligible to request that would allow me to create a purchase order. And you can come here and you can look at the thing you're requesting, and you can see what would it allow me to do. Okay, this one allows me to create a purchase order. So it adds this level of intelligibility, because I would never really know from the group name which was the one that was going to let me, you know, do what I need to do, like reset a password or do something with, I don't know if we have anything in here for Kubernetes or, you know, something like an admin type of thing. Principal, let's say you need to be able to do something else. I don't know. Change service principal credentials. Let's see if we have any groups that allow you to do something technical that I'm eligible for. Nope, I'm not eligible for anything like that. It allows you to as an end user, and we're going to make nice wizards for this, where the AI, this would be great, because then it could talk to you. It could figure out what you're saying and which functions that maps to, and then it could call a tool or an API to figure out which things grant those functions. So this will be really good to help the AI processes along. And then the last thing before I jump back into this, I don't want you to have too much time, is that when you go to do recertification, then the good thing is typically when a manager is recertifying someone's access, they have no idea what any of it means, because they have no clue. It's all technical gobbledygook. But what we allow you to do here is, where is that? Well, this one doesn't have anything interesting. What we allow you to see, it's like, okay, we're going to certify something like, well, this is account ownership. So that's not a good example. But if I had one that was maybe more interesting, let's see if I got one. It allow you to see the thing that you're making a decision. Okay, these are all account ownership, but imagine this was a group, and the group was called low security. This one looks okay, but then if you click on this, you see that this group allows you to delete Active Directory domain controllers. Then that's like, whoa, why do you need this? Why do you need this? Doesn't make any sense. And then you also can see here a summary of the functions for the subject of the request. So this is a person. It'll show you their functional access. So you can see how risky is this person, and does it make sense that Mark Wilson can delete domain controllers? Because I might look at that and I'm like, okay, that's a red flag, and that doesn't make any sense. And that helps me make sense instead of rubber stamping this. So let's go back. So now we had our functions. We understand functions. Functions are valuable independent of risk policies. And the thing that customers want, which we should do, we need more BA people. We need more people with the skill set to do it when we're trying to hire. But they want, okay, I have Workday. Give me all the standard functions for Workday. I have SAP. Give me all the standard functions that anyone would care about for SAP, Azure, ServiceNow, Salesforce. They want us to come preloaded with, you have Salesforce, let's import this function pack, let's import this risk pack. That way they have more instant value. So that's something we have the engine, but we need to develop these out-of-the-box function packs and risk pack. That's something that we should be working on this next year. But let's go ahead. So now we have our functions. We can go create risk policy. One thing to mention is mitigating control. A mitigating control in the risk world is basically to say, if someone's going to violate a risk, and I'm the risk owner, I'm the one who my job is on the line, I'm the one that has to approve it. Approving it means it's called mitigating. You can't just approve it. You have to say, I'm accepting the risk, and I'm also going to do these things to make it less risky. So mitigating controls are things like, okay, I'm going to allow Mark to delete domain controller, but I'm going to check the transaction log monthly, or I'm going to do something else. So you can define mitigating controls, and we'll see how this all comes together. But then when you go to your risk policy, we already kind of saw it. So a risk policy in the case of SOD is you simply say, hey, you assign an owner. This is the person who is the risk owner that typically will be the person approving the risk violations if someone violates. That's important. Then down here, you can see who's violating currently, who's been mitigated, who violated, and somebody said, I'm not accepting it, I rejected it. So, and the rules we saw, all of that. But the definition of this is the mappings, and it's very simple. It's, hey, if you can do any of these functions, then we better never find out that you can also do any of these functions. So that part's simple. Now, the violation part, there's what's called preventative and detective. Preventative, I'll show you, which means that when someone's requesting access, you need to detect that if they got that access, it would violate a risk policy so that people can choose to prevent it if they wish to. Detective is somebody out in that system got added to the group and we discovered it on inventory and we've detected that now they're violating, and we can raise it up. So on your risk policy, you can say whether or not you want to send detected violations for approval. You could just want to report on them and notice them but not do anything. Or you could say, I want to pick these up and generate a business request and route it for someone to choose to mitigate it or to revoke it and remove that access. So that's the way that works. So let's go look at detective since we're running low on time. Let me go here. And let me just request access to my toxic combination. Let's go, I'll just pick a random victim here. Let's pick Nancy. I made mine eligible. Everybody's eligible, so you wouldn't have to worry about that if you're going to use these for testing. I called it test function. So I'm going to request the toxic combination test function. And I'm going to request the segregated function. And segregated just means that, hey, it's segregated away. You shouldn't have it in combination with this other thing. That's the language a lot of people use in this area. Now, once I add it to my shopping cart, before I submit, I say evaluate the request, which does a risk check. And we can see here that it said that, hey, this one is going to violate this risk policy. It's SOD. And the source is from this, that you're requesting access to this group. And this one is going to violate the risk policy. So that's my toxic combination. I have to pick a justification if I still want to submit it. And I have to acknowledge it, which gets saved in the database. So if they have to go back and the auditors ask if the user acknowledged the risk, we store that. Then you can enter a name. And I'll submit it. Let me see if my session timed out over here yet or not. Okay, so I made this test workflow. I think it's shipping. It's easy to use. It's basically say person risk check. You can pick a person. You can pick the options, ignore previously mitigated risk and some other things. And then you can pick, hey, if they were to be added to these groups and they were to be added to these management roles, would any of these cause a violation? So this is handy to test your risk policies quickly. And because they don't have to be requested on the IAM shop, you can just test them, anything. And this shows the violations. But now this is just a lookup. So you see how easy it is to call. So here we go. So to test it, there's a component of view called AZ Global Risk Assignee. So assignee's risk resulting risk, get by person with new assignees. So this is, hey, for this person, if they were to get these new assignees, and of course, assignees can be business roles and locations, groups, anything. And it has a couple options. So really, this is super easy. It's just a method that you can call in a workflow, in a lookup, or be an API. You pass in a person, pass in a list of assignees, and then it's going to pass back a list of risks that would be violated if that person were added to those assignees. So we made it really, really easy. It's not this complicated engine. It's just pretty easy to use, just FYI. That's handy if you're testing. You could run this person risk check workflow. So now, back to this. So we submitted our access request. It got routed. It went through the business request engine. And how does the risk approval work? Here we go. So here's my business request. So in your approval flow policy, there's a specific step you can add, which is called risk owner approval. And it's a specific step type called a risk approval. So if your approval flow policy has that risk owner approval step, then that step, the engine only activates it if your business request or the item is going to violate a risk. So you see here, in this case, I requested my segregated group. I requested my other group, my function group. They both went in this policy for the group owner approval first. And then if those get approved, both of them, then it's going to go to this risk owner step for approval. And the risk owner can see all kinds of information. I'm wondering who my risk owner is here. Oh, I know who my risk owner is. I can show you what they would see. But the risk owner, let's do that. They would get an email notification if those are approved. So let me approve these, actually. So here I am as the risk admin. I'm doing an ultra zoom here. But so I have the risk tab. I can see, hey, this is going to violate my test segregation of duties. There's a lot of information that a risk owner would understand, like the definition of the risk. Hey, it's this function in combination with this function. That's all good stuff. And then if they come to make a decision for the risk step, it's always approve and reject. And when I click approve, it pops up and any mitigating controls that were assigned to my global risk definition will appear here. I have to pick at least one. I can pick multiple. And then I have to pick an end date because the risk, I'm not saying you can violate this risk forever. I'm going to say you can violate this risk until some date in the future, like maybe 1 year. And then when a risk violation, once this expires or is about to expire, we can pick them back up and send them for generate a task for the risk owner to choose to mitigate it and extend it. So this is not one that's preventative. This is one that we detected based upon the data out there that Nelly is violating this risk. We can see, the details here of Nelly. We can see some other stuff. But if I revoke this, then the fulfillment workflow is going to go and remove that access, or it should. If all the fulfillment workflows are implemented properly, they should revoke the offending access. And it records, if you go look at the violation page, the violation will be flagged as rejected. And then that matters in the history tracking because the violation has a history where the first time you violate, let's say we detect Mark violates today. He got added to a group. Now he's violating the policy. And then nobody does anything. And tomorrow they remove Mark from the group. The history is going to say he was violating, first time detected, and now he's not violating. And the violation is not active anymore. It's flagged as inactive. And then if Mark gets added again, it's going to add another item to the history and says second time detected Mark violating. It's going to flag the violation as active. So just so you know, there is this history. There's one violation created, but there's a history of when it's active or inactive and when the state changes. Now, if we mitigate, we say mark is approved, then every time we detect it, it's not going to change anything because, we know about it and he's mitigated. But if we reject, then it's gonna say, hey, it's gonna reopen the violation if we detect that mark is violating again and it was rejected. So there's some logic there. I hope we have it documented. But there's some logic about what happens for the violation history when we detect you lost it and you gain it when it was mitigated and allowed versus rejected and we detect it happen again. We should make sure we have that documented. And here's where you can see your rule pre-mitigations. Yeah, and when they expire as well. They have a valid until. Oh, and then there's some complicated setting about coverage violations found after. That was added for Aldi. I hope that means that you can somehow pre-mitigate a rule that only cover existing violations, but then allow new violations. So it's like you want to pre-mitigate and say everybody who violated it had this before this date. They're pre-mitigated, but anything new, it's a new, we don't want the system to get clogged up with existing violations. So we pre-mitigate everybody before this date. So if we look out here, there are these digest emails. These are digest emails as well. So basically there are these reports where the engine calculates who subscribes to it, and then it has a template and it can inject like really complex, pretty table data. Like in this case, this is a report to mitigating control owners that shows all the risk violations and assignees for their mitigating control. Or here's one that's a report to risk owners showing all the rules violate. So it's really complex multi-table data that in these complicated reports that you can say, yes, I want it and I want to get it quarterly. And yes, I want. So there's all the digest emails, the same thing. It's like, yeah, I want to get all the things that are pending me to do. And instead of getting notified individually, I want a daily digest report. And it generates this pretty tabular report that you can subscribe to on a frequency. So this is kind of a really cool thing. It'd be nice. RT did some really cool stuff on that. Be cool to document how to generate a new one out there for some other things, because they can have a lot more complicated data than you can have in a web UI report, which is just one component, one view. This can merge and mix data, and it is pretty handy. But we do have the ones that Christiana mentioned, which are for the mitigating. If you own a mitigating control, if you own a risk, if you own a function, and they pump out a lot of related things all at once that you would want to see in one single report instead of all these disconnected reports. All right. Well, thanks everybody. See you later.